Welcome to the Vision for Life podcast, an ongoing conversation between the pastors of Fellowship Denver and the church at large. Each week, we talk about life, faith, the Bible, and how to follow Jesus as we go about our daily lives. I'm Autumn, the host of the podcast, and Hunter is joining me today. Hunter, glad you're here.
Autumn, I'm glad you're here.
We're both glad that the other is here. And we are recording the second episode of our fall book club series today. Are you ready for this?
I am ready. Are you ready?
Yes.
Okay.
We took a short diversion when we were planning for this episode to look for area rugs for me.
That's right. We sure did.
Yes. I moved into a different house at the end of July. I need an area rug for my living room. So
And I've shopped online for rugs enough that I just am on rug mailing lists. And so I just started sharing my sources with Autumn.
That's right. Yes. So if our planning for the episode fell short, it's due to my selection of an area rug.
That's right. Now, the real problem is not that you can't find a rug.
It's that I can't afford the one that I want.
The one you want is a couple of $1,000s more than you budgeted for. So I'm just trying to convince you that you have the money.
Yeah, it wasn't exactly the sort of support I was looking for, but, thanks. Thanks, Hunter.
That's the kind of friend I am, though. I'm not the one. I'm not the person you come to for advice when you need the cheapest solution.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. You didn't try to talk me out of purchasing the rug that I actually want.
No, I try to help people justify impulsive, ridiculous purchases.
You don't make that many impulsive, ridiculous purchases yourself.
No, I don't. I'm pretty measured in that, which is why I'm good at giving advice on this, because I know when it is time to go for it. And this particular rug you want, it's probably time to go for it.
Well, it's a great justification. I don't think I can, but thanks for being a friend and entering into the conversation and the search with me.
All right. Now, if you like autumn shopping updates more than wardrobe updates, please be sure to vote in our reader poll.
That's right. Our ongoing requests for your feedback having to do with whether we should release the podcast in video format as well as audio format. And last week we mentioned that releasing the podcast in video format alleviates the need for any wardrobe updates.
That's right. And it would also allow people to see this wonderful studio we record in, which our friend and producer Jesse has curated and put together, and it has a lot of interesting art. It has a pillow shaped like the head of a cat.
It does.
It's not shaped like the head of a cat. It's not only shaped, but a big cat face is printed on it. So we could show that off. Some guitars, some musical instruments. There's a lot of good things we could do with video.
So send us your feedback. Let us know if you are a yay vote for the video podcast format. All right. Well, let's get into it. If anyone has area rug suggestions, I'm looking for an 8x10 rug, you can send those my way too. But let's get into our discussion today. We are on part 2 of our 3-part discussion on the book Silas Marner, and we'd like to also record a Q&R episode. So if you have been reading Silas Marner or are tracking along with our conversations and have any questions that come up or suggestions, please send those to podcast@fellowshipdenver.org, and we will work those questions and suggestions into a concluding episode for our book club episodes. Last week, we covered chapters 1 through 6 in the book, and today we are picking up the story and our discussion in chapter 7. So, Hunter, help us know where we're jumping in today.
I'm still thinking of the question that we posed at the end of the last episode, and it went something like this. Silas Marner experiences betrayal, and as a result of that, he withdraws from society. He withdraws from human contact. He moves to Raveloe. Remember, he lived in Lantern Yard. He moves to Raveloe, where he kind of takes up the life as an isolated weaver and a hoarder of gold coins, right? And his work becomes the thing that grounds him in reality, and he places all of his value into this growing stash of money, and then his money is stolen. So we kind of ask, like, when his money, which is the most precious thing at this point in his life, when it's stolen, and he's wronged yet again, how is he going to respond to that? And what do chapter 7 through 12 reveal about his response?
Well, they don't give us a conclusive answer actually to this question that we ended the previous episode with, but they do begin to respond to that question, to give us glimpses of the way that this second betrayal, the second loss and tragedy in Silas's life, the way that it pushes him back into slowly the life of the community. But where we left off in the story, the initial push back into the life of the community was not slow, but it was sort of shocking. He shows up at the Rainbow, which is a pub, and there are various characters. We're introduced in chapter 6 to some of the men at the Rainbow, and that continues to unfold, that scene of Silas going to the Rainbow in the pounding rain, coming in drenched and seeking help, seeking some sort of solace, seeking some sort of connection that will help him make sense of what has just happened, that the thing that he most prized, most valued is now gone, ripped away in an instant. And so in chapter 7, we're introduced to more of the characters in the town, and we see that Silas is forced into this place of interaction with the neighbors with whom he'd had very little contact for the last 15 years.
So we do have some answer to our question, how's he going to respond? He actually reaches out to people for help. He shows them who he is, and he shows them his problem, and that's something he's never done. And so it's a very vulnerable, very tender kind of moment there. It's not the fullness of his response that we'll get in the third part of the book, which we'll talk about next week. But you are beginning to see this turn in the narrative, which really is marked by him going to the Rainbow, and then the town begins discussing. Everyone in the town begins discussing what's happened to him, and you get this humorous look at like a small town and how one person's problem can kind of become the talk of the town, and that's what happens to Silas. So he's transformed from being this reclusive, mysterious guy to now being the talk of the town.
Yes. And how one person's difficulty or tragedy in this sense actually ignites this sort of life in the town.
Yeah.
It's something of interest, and they all become preoccupied with what had happened to Silas. And in this, not only does Silas reach out to some people in the town of Raveloe, but they begin to interact with him. And so we're introduced in chapters 7 through 12, what we're covering today, to a couple of the people in the town, to a Mr. Macy and to Dolly Winthrop, who become characters that we learn more and more about. They're more and more influential as the story continues to unfold.
Mr. Macy is a leader in the church. What's his title? What's his position?
I don't remember what his title is.
He's like the church warden, though.
Yeah.
He's not the rector, he's not the minister, but he's kind of the lay guy who runs the church and reads the liturgy. Now, a little fascinating tidbit here. This would have been in the era when the churches, this in England, where this is set, that the state churches, the Church of England, used the Book of Common Prayer. So Dolly Winthrop, who goes to the church, and Mr. Muncie will talk about the readings in church, and they're reading through the liturgy in the Book of Common Prayer. The parishioners would come and they would listen to it. Some of them weren't literate in a small town. Dolly Winthrop, who's also a character who shows up, and she's a parishioner at the church, but you get the sense that maybe Dolly's not literate. So she can listen to the liturgy, but she can't actually read the book herself. So these characters start to show up. Now, there's another thread of the narrative that's kind of unfolding separately from Silas's. So the story is really like two stories that are kind of running on parallel tracks. There's the story of Silas, and he's moved to Raveloe, and his weaving, and his collection of gold, and his loss. There's also the aristocratic, the gentry of the town, the Cass family. And one of the sons, whose name is Godfrey Cass, Godfrey has secretly married a woman in another town who's addicted to opium, and he has a child by her, and he's trying to keep that hidden or secret because he's ashamed of it. And he's in love with another woman in the town, so he kind of wants to be able to carry on with her and not let people know about his wife. And that's a parallel story, right? And you're reading this, and because the narrator is giving you both stories, you are seeing like these two trains kind of coming together, and eventually his story and Silas's story are going to intersect. That's kind of when the plot really begins to all come together. But and you can start to see how they're going to intersect, how Godfrey Cass keeping this thing hidden, this secret that he's not letting anyone in on, is having effects on other people in the town. It's going to have an effect on Silas, and yet Silas doesn't know that yet. And Godfrey doesn't know that yet. So you as the reader kind of have an omniscient God's eye view, so to speak, that the narrator is giving you. And you're watching how people's lives intersect and influence each other.
Yeah, that's actually a literary term, the omniscient narrator.
The omniscient narrator. Thank you so much.
Yes. And that is the perspective from which the book is being written. So as you're saying, Hunter, we can see the interior life, the sort of private life, if you will, of the various characters. A bit about Squire Cass, who is Godfrey's father. We're introduced to him and some of his inner workings and motivations, to Godfrey himself, who has this secret that he's keeping. We see some of the thoughts, or what takes place in Silas Marner's heart and mind. And we start to see that the things that are taking place in their private lives, or in their inner workings, their motivations, that those begin to impact the people around them, even though the characters themselves don't have that perspective. They can't see how what is going on in them is actually affecting the people around them and the town.
And here's how these two bits of the narrative come together. And they come together in the last chapter we're reading this week, which is chapter 12. Godfrey's wife comes to town looking for him and brings the child. And she comes with the intention of exposing this and putting this out in the public. And she gets caught in the snowstorm, and she never makes it to Godfrey's house, and she falls in the snow and she dies, and she's close to where Silas lives. And the little girl crawls through the snow and into the light of Silas Marner's weaving studio, and he comes back into his house and finds this little girl who is at his house, and he now has to decide what he's going to do with this little girl.
So this scene, the chapters that we're discussing, begins with Silas entering the rainbow, reaching out to his fellow man. The town begins to interact with him more. We learn more about the Cass family and the Lammeter family, the woman that Godfrey Cass loves and would love to be married to, but can't because he's in this other secret marriage. Her name is Nancy Lammeter. The Lammeters are also one of the older families in the town and aren't the gentry as the Casses are, but are very highly regarded. And so we're introduced to more and more of the characters and the life of the town. And as you said, Hunter, these two streams, these two narratives that are running parallel. We talked last week about Dunsey, who was Godfrey's younger brother, and said that in contrast to Godfrey, Dunsey was carefree. He squandered his inheritance and his father's wealth. He didn't care about saving face and didn't really care about what the perception was of him, but he did like to have leverage over Godfrey. So in the prior week, we talked about Dunsey and how he is a part of the picture that's given to us of the Cass family, of this family who would have been sort of old nobility and still held sway in this area. In this section of the book, we learn that Dunsey has gone missing. And interestingly, in that omniscient narrator perspective, his story just sort of trails off at this point in the book. We see more and more of what's happening in the interior life of Godfrey and of Silas, and then learn nothing at this point about Dunsey. But Dunsey has disappeared. We see that the townspeople, especially Dolly Winthrop, reaching out to Silas Marner, extending compassion in some cases, curiosity in others, toward him. And then, interestingly, as you said, before this final scene, which is a bit dramatic, in which Eppie appears in Silas Marner's doorway, Before that, Dolly Winthrop actually begins to not only care for Silas Marner and reach out to him, but also to invite him back to church.
That's right.
To attend church
Yeah.
with her.
That's right. Okay, now we know that Dunsey stole the gold, but the narrator leaves us off there. We know that Dunsey is the one who's stolen the gold, but we don't know what he's done with the gold. We don't know what's happened to him.
He and the gold disappear.
He and the gold disappear, and you get the sense that they're gone, right? And so Silas is dealing with the fallout of that, and Dunsey's brother Godfrey is trying to keep hidden his affair. And so these are the threads of the plot that start to come together, and they all kind of converge when this little girl, who is Godfrey Cass's daughter, his unclaimed daughter, when she shows up at Silas Marner's door, and he has to decide what to do with her. Okay, I think one of the best ways to kind of analyze this part of the story is just to think through a few of the major characters, and we've read the rest of the book, so we actually selected 4 characters who are going to be kind of major characters from this point forward. And I think looking at each one of these characters and what's going on with them and what they represent is probably a fun way to analyze this. So let's think about this child who shows up at the end of the story or the
Chapter
section
12.
today. Yeah. Let's think about Godfrey. Let's think about this character, Dolly Winthrop, we introduced. She's going to be a big player in Silas's life going forward. And then let's think about Silas himself.
That sounds great.
Okay.
Let's do it. Well, why don't we start with Godfrey? So in the story, if we're examining him as a character, what does Godfrey represent?
Well, he's like a foil to Silas in that he is dealing with his struggle in a different way. He's not only a foil like socioeconomically, he's the gentry and Silas is kind of this worker. Godfrey is the center of the town's social life and Silas is on the edge of the town. But there's also a sense in which Godfrey is unwilling to let others see him in his place of vulnerability, which is that he's formed this marriage, this shameful marriage, and he's had this daughter, and I guess it's shameful in the sense that this woman doesn't measure up to his kind of social status or whatnot. And so he's unwilling to acknowledge his own vulnerability that might cause others to think less of him. And so he's trying to keep this thing secret and hidden. And also he's trying to manipulate circumstances in order to bring some resolution to this without anyone ever having to see what he's actually done. And he'll continue on that trajectory for the rest of the novel, just kind of in the shadows, manipulating things, never fully being public about what he's done. And then you have Silas, on the other hand, who decides to kind of reach out for help and let other people see him in his vulnerability. So in that way, they're very different characters, and they kind of provide foils to each other.
If Godfrey is sort of the foil to Silas, and as you mentioned, this is set up in various ways, not only in their social status, but also in the depiction of, as you said, Godfrey's life at the center of the town, Silas is at the edge. There's even a geographic representation of that, with Silas's cottage being at the edge of Raveloe, just outside the town, and that is indicative of the way that he himself had existed on the fringes of society in Raveloe for all of these years. So if Silas acts as a foil to Godfrey, then what else does Silas represent? Fill in this character of Silas for us in the story.
Well, we've already said Silas is the one who reaches out for help. He lets people see his problems, see his vulnerability. And in that, he becomes the character who's going to change, the character who is going to grow, whose life is going to expand and become bigger as the rest of the novel unfolds. And so I think it's interesting that George Eliot is setting these two characters up. One is kind of stuck in his own sin and can't really change because he can't acknowledge it. And the other one is going to change because he can be vulnerable. Now, there might be other themes like Godfrey seems to have a lot more to lose, so to speak. He's got this prominent family, this social standing, this wealth, this reputation.
And Nancy, he thinks he will lose Nancy.
He thinks he'll lose Nancy. So he's got a lot, and therefore it seems really risky for him to be public and vulnerable. And Silas, now that his gold is gone, doesn't have a lot to lose. And yet even there's a little bit of a lesson of like, it's often when we come to the end of ourselves and we don't have anything to lose, so nothing to protect, that we are actually most open to being transformed. And sometimes when we feel like we have a lot that we have to protect or keep tabs on or we can't risk with, that's when we're actually most at risk of being stuck and not growing and not changing. So there's an interesting lesson there for people who have a lot. To beware of the dangers of having a lot and having a lot to protect, and how that might actually keep you from experiencing the love of other people, the love of God, redemption. But Silas is the character who's going to change. He's the one who's going to grow. And it all really begins with him taking that journey to the Rainbow Inn and knocking on the door and letting the town know what has happened to him. And you see another glimpse of it at the end of this section when this little girl shows up and he has to decide what he's going to do with this little girl. And he's going to open himself up further to the possibility of change and transformation.
There's a quote that captures this moment, that captures the potential that Marner has for redemption or for a sort of restoration at the moment when he goes to seek help from his neighbors and enters the rainbow. And as he's sitting there, this quote says, "This strangely novel situation of opening his trouble to his Raveloe neighbors, of sitting in the warmth of a hearth not his own, and feeling the presence of faces and voices which were his nearest promise of help, had doubtless its influence on Marner, in spite of his passionate preoccupation with his loss. Our consciousness rarely registers the beginning of a growth within us any more than without us. There have been many circulations of the sap before we detect the smallest sign of the bud."
Mm-hmm. And that picture there suggests that this is the first little bud of growth in him, and it's going to become bigger.
Well, there's another character that I mentioned who is important, as you said, for the rest of the story. And her name is Dolly Winthrop. And what does Dolly represent in the story, Hunter?
Dolly is going to be a character who comes alongside Silas, and she really helps him grow, helps him navigate a new life that he opens himself up to. And she represents faith. She represents the Christian faith. She represents Christian witness to him. She is kind of contrasted against another character, Mr. Muncie?
Mr. Macy.
Mr. Macy. Mr. Macy. I said, when we were discussing this earlier, I said Mr. Muncie, and you kept saying Mr. Macy, Mr. Macy, Mr. Macy. And
Carried right on in.
I haven't learned yet. So here we are. We're live on the air, and I'm stumbling over the characters' names. Mr. Macy. Mr. Macy is the official church warden. He represents like the official religion, and he also reaches out to Silas and tries to convince Silas that he needs to come to church, and Silas is not having anything to do with Mr. Macy. And then right after Mr. Macy like runs in there and bounces off the wall that is Silas, then Dolly Winthrop slides in there. She makes some lard cakes, which I've never had any lard cakes.
Nope.
I'm not sure what those are exactly, but they sound good. It's lard. It's a cake. I mean, what could go wrong? She slides in there with these lard cakes.
It says she was well known for her lard cakes.
She was well known,
in
and
Raveloe.
she also mentions that she doesn't eat the lard cakes, but she knows men like them. Men are strange characters, she says, and they like these lard cakes. So she slides in there. She's got a 7-year-old son named Aaron. She brings him with her, and she slides into Silas's studio, his little workshop.
On a Sunday.
His atelier, as they would say in French. She slides into his atelier and with some lard cakes, and she begins to help him. And he kind of reluctantly, but nevertheless does accept her and opens himself up to her. And she becomes this midwife to the transformation that happens in him. Now, she also invites him to church. So Mr. Macy tries to convince Silas to come to church. He's not having any of it. And then Dolly tries to convince Silas to come to church. And Silas tells her, I've never been to church before. I've been to chapel, and that's his previous kind of fundamentalist, non-official Church of England sect that he's been part of. And Dolly's afraid to ask what chapel is because she's afraid that might be where devils play. and yet you get the sense when she says, well, Mr. Marner, you ought to be coming to church every now and then, that he's not totally closed off to the idea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Dolly is plain spoken. And you said before, it seems the story indicates that she's illiterate. And yet she has a depth of practical knowledge that is combined with a warmth and compassion that makes her uniquely able to befriend Silas Marner. So if Godfrey represents the sort of like his inability to be confronted with his sin, his inability to be vulnerable or to repent of what he's done wrong, to acknowledge his shortcomings, to acknowledge what he's done wrong. That makes him, at this point in the story and going forward, unable to really receive forgiveness, to receive any kind of restoration, to receive redemption. And Silas, at this point in the story, we see these beginnings of the potential for restoration, the potential for redemption. And so much of that is affected in the story through this character of Dolly Winthrop. And Dolly is an embodied sort of kind, compassionate, real faith. So she has a sort of genuine faith that compels her to reach out to many people in the community. And Silas is one of them who she feels compassion for. She sees his need. She sees the depth of his anguish. And she comes and invites herself in to his home.
That's right.
But then she continues to be present in his life and in the story from this point forward as this sort of representation of a sort of simple, genuine faith.
Yes, and there's a great little quote where she says, well, Master Marner, it's never too late to turn over a new leaf. And if you've never had no church, there's no telling the good it'll do you. For I feel so set up and comfortable as never was when I've been and heard the prayers and the singing to the praise and glory of God as Mr. Macy gives out. and so she says it's never too late to turn over a new leaf. And this is kind of like a prophetic word about this is what's going to happen for Silas. He's going to turn over a new leaf. Not just religiously. In fact, that's kind of a subplot, but he's going to turn over a new leaf in terms of his relationship with people in the world.
And this brings us to the last character that we wanted to discuss who's important in the narrative from this point on, and that's the child. At this point in the story, the child isn't named. She is a child of maybe almost 2, somewhere around that age. I don't know if her exact age is ever represented in the story, but she is a small toddler, not very verbal, and we just learn of her existence at the conclusion of chapter 12, in the sense that she shows up physically in the story. We later learn that she is named Epi, but at this point, she's just the child. So what does the child represent at this point in the story?
Well, she is described as representing a new kind of gold for Silas, and she's the replacement gold in some ways. Now, George Eliot actually puts that in the story. The way the story sets up, Marner has one of his fits where he kind of goes into a trance. And he's upright, but he's kind of unconscious, and he's upright. And it's while he's in one of those trances outside with the door open that the girl comes in to his house. And then when he comes to and goes back in the house, it says this: turning toward the hearth, where the two logs had fallen apart and sent forth only a red, uncertain glimmer. He seated himself on his fireside chair and was stooping to push his logs together when, to his blurred vision, it seemed as if there were gold on the floor in front of the hearth. Gold! His own gold, brought back to him as mysteriously as it had been taken away. He felt his heart begin to beat violently, and for a few moments he was unable to stretch out his hand and grasp the restored treasure. The heap of gold seemed to glow and get larger beneath his agitated gaze. He leaned forward at last and stretched forth his hand, but instead of the hearth coin with a familiar resisting outline, his fingers encountered soft, warm curls. In utter amazement, Silas fell on his knees and bent his head low to examine the marvel. It was a sleeping child, a round, fair thing with soft yellow rings all over its head. So her hair is like gold, and he thinks it's gold, and turns out it's this little girl.
So Eliot is using the child now to say there was this new treasure that had entered Silas's home. And he initially thinks that it is his gold. But then, of course, in this moment, as the reader, you see that the potential that this child holds is that she could be a treasure that is far greater than the gold that she had lost. But that is the question that this section ends with. What will become of this child? And how, now that their stories have collided, now that Godfrey Cass's daughter, who he had disavowed, has entered Silas's life, the two parallel tracks are beginning to collide. These two narrative themes that you described, Hunter, are colliding in this moment in Silas Marner's house. And so this is one of the pivotal moments of the novel in which Epi, the child who represents this treasure, appears in Silas's life. And the two stories, the stories of Godfrey Cass and the story of Silas Marner, become intertwined. It's also interesting at this point in the story that we get a small glimpse into Silas's life before Lantern Yard. And up to this point, up to the point in the story when he had lost his gold, he was completely closed off from the community. And then we see these stirrings in the chapters we discussed today, this possibility that he might reintegrate into the life of Raveloe. He might experience a sort of restoration and redemption with his fellow man, with the other people around him, as depicted in these particular characters of Dolly Winthrop, her son Aaron, and the people who begin to reach out to him. And now this is another pivotal moment in this transformation in Silas's life. And in this moment, he remembers caring for his little sister. And he says, first he thinks it's his gold. And then he says, in this sort of state of being unsure of what is going on, then he says, could this be his little sister? And so we get a glimpse of him caring for his sister, who we learn died. And then memories from Lantern Yard, from his previous life, come rushing back in this instance. So the child represents the treasure and the potential to tie his past now to his future.
Yeah, and you kind of bringing that out, I'm sitting here thinking it also represents a redemption of these threads from his past, or at least the potential for that. Lantern Yard was obviously a place that was initially a place of life to him and became this place of betrayal, and he lost his sister. So there's been a lot of grief and loss in his life, and in his flashbacks, you start to see like maybe there's going to be a redemption of those threads of grief and loss.
Well, I think that is the question that we end on this week. What will become now of the child and Silas, now that all of these narrative threads have collided at this point in the story? And how will the story take shape from here? And will Silas Marner actually experience this potential for restoration and redemption that is captured in this moment?
And for the reader, I think we are left here particularly reflecting on the importance of vulnerability and letting others in to help you when you're vulnerable, as opposed to trying to keep up appearances and keep everything kind of squared away in the public eye and hidden away. And so it invites us to as readers to reflect on that theme as well. And we'll see what happens next.
I think there's one last reflection that we're invited into in this section. Godfrey Cass has to keep in order to save face, he has to bury his secrets, keep them hidden away. Silas Marner, when he reaches out to his neighbors, he also, as he's grasping for a way to make sense of the theft of the loss of his gold, his mind reaches toward one man who he knows, who he suspects might be responsible, and that man is present in the rainbow. And so initially, Silas accuses him of stealing his gold, or asks him if he stole it. And then as it becomes obvious that this man was not responsible, Silas goes up to him, walks directly up to him, and apologizes and says that he realizes that he wasn't responsible and asks for his forgiveness for the accusation. And so that, too, I think we're invited to see here, again, these two set against each other. What comes about in Godfrey's life, how this acts as sort of a disease that spreads in his life, and how in Silas's life, when he reaches out in this moment, and he realizes not only that he had been wronged, but that he was wrong to falsely accuse someone, he asks for forgiveness, and this opens up this potential for connection even more.
That's a great pickup. And from this point forward, I think what we should expect is Silas is going to change. He's going to grow. He's going to expand. And Godfrey is stuck. And we'll see how that happens in the next episode.
All right. Well, Hunter, thank you. To those of you listening, we hope you are enjoying tracking through these episodes with us. If you've been reading Silas Marner, let us know. And as I mentioned earlier in the episode, send us your questions. And as always, if you have questions or suggestions, articles for us to read, any of those things, we love hearing from you. And you can send all of that anytime to podcast@fellowshipdenver.org. Thanks for joining us on the Vision for Life podcast. Special thanks to Adam Englund for our theme music, to Jesse Cowan, our producer, and to Judd Connell, who provides transcription for these episodes.